want an annexation, you want, sort of a mythological scene from Ovid or from some sort of important text, but you don't just want a picture that just shows a peasant with cows. And effectively that's what the Dutch Italianates did, and that's what's so modern about them in a way, is that there are scenes from everyday life. And they then become incredibly influential in the centuries to come. So in the 18th and 19th century, the Dutch Italianates become some of the best painters in terms of collectors, in terms of collecting, in terms of other artists being influenced by them. One of the most important landscape artists in England in the 18th and 19th century was again a Frenchman who moved to England called Philippe de Loutherbourg. And Philippe de Loutherbourg painted landscapes that look just like Dutch Italian landscapes. And curiously enough, he is then Bourgeois' master teacher in terms of painting. And so Bourgeois' taste for Dutch Italians probably comes that way. But the tide changes, and towards the middle and end of the 19th century, like everything in fashion, people start moving on and start looking at different things. This is when people start to look at Rembrandt and other artists that were not as important, or considered as important or famous beforehand. And there's a very key and interesting episode when Constable, John Constable, who was the great landscape artist in England at the time, who was fascinated with Dutch landscapes. He loved Hobbema, he loved Ruysdael, but he really couldn't stand the Dutch Italianates. And that was simply because he thought that there were, he said, a bastard style. It was just a mix of two things that had nothing to do with each other. He liked Dutch artists when they were Dutch and they painted Dutch landscapes. He liked Italian artists if they were Italian. He didn't like the fact that this was a mix between two things that he saw as being totally incompatible. And during one of his famous lectures in London in the 1800s, he sort of raged against the Dutch Italianates, again calling it a bastard style and saying that they were absolutely awful. And at the end of the lecture, there's this very famous episode where a member of the public, a collector, came up to him and said, my family's been collecting Burkhems all of their life. I suppose I shouldn't really keep them. What should I do with them? Should I just sell them? And Constable said, no, don't sell them. That will only continue this evil. You have to burn them. Of course, hopefully the collector didn't burn them. We don't know, but I doubt it is. But this is really the beginning of the end, in a way, of when people like subsequently Ruskin, who's the great 19th century art critic in England, he really sort of raged against these sort of artists. And this is when a new taste develops, what we think about Victorian taste, in terms of earlier pictures, medieval pictures, Italian pictures with gold backgrounds, early Italian Renaissance artists, people like Fra Angelico and Botticelli. So it all kind of moves on. And the Dutch Italianates have really been hidden away until fairly recently. And we are one of the collections in England that has the largest group of Dutch Italianates. And I have to say, over the last 10 years, there's been a resurgence of more interest in them and a lot more study going into them, especially in Holland. We know very little about the artists that you'll see downstairs, and if you look at the catalogue, it has very useful little biographies at the end for each artist, and I've seen that downstairs are storyboards with little bits about their biographies. But a lot of these artists, there's still a lot of confusion about when they were in Italy, were they in Italy at all, how they operated, what the relationship was with other artists of the time. A lot of trouble about attributions of pictures as well, and when you'll go downstairs, you'll also notice that the label, the modern label next to the picture will tell you that the picture is by a specific artist, but when you look at the frame has a different name on it. And this is simply to do with the fact that a picture in 1811 was probably considered to be by someone else. We now know it's by someone else altogether. So there are changes in attribution, and of course we left the old names on the frames because it's a historical thing in a way. It is confusing, I admit, but it is very interesting. And so over the last 10 years, there's been a whole series of exhibitions. We did a very big exhibition on the Dutch Italianates, borrowing pictures from other collections. And there's then been monographic shows on many of these artists. There's been a very large Cowp exhibition at the National Gallery in London. There's been one on Burkhem in Haarlem a couple of years ago. There was one on Dujardin in Amsterdam last year. So slowly, I think this is the beginning of reevaluating these artists and looking at them. And I think it's, with all art, it's very, very difficult for anyone to decide what is great art. We all follow fashion, we all follow, it's like music. Musicians exhibitions that were particularly fashionable 50 years ago and not today, and vice versa. And so this is the way, in a way, where we have to look at art and think about it in a broader spectrum. And so downstairs, I think, you need to think about how great these artists were, but not only in their times, but how influential they've been, and how we wouldn't have had many other subsequent artists. I think, in some way, even Impressionism, a lot of the lessons about how to depict light that you see in Impressionist painters come ultimately from painters like the Dutch Italianates, filtered through generations of other artists. So I think with this, let's kind of go downstairs, and what I'll do is walk through the exhibition, and obviously I won't be able to stop at every single one of the 40 pictures, but I think we'll just look at some of the key artists and some of the key pictures. Yeah.
If they weren't going to interact with the Italian painters or schools, and they weren't going to interact with the surroundings, why did they go to Rome instead of just painting in Holland in the first place?
Well, I think they did interact with the surroundings in terms of the ruins, the weather, the landscape. I mean, you have to think Dutch landscape is fairly boring. I mean, it's just
flat. Okay, so it was just the stimulation.
It's the idea of kind of moving out and going to see a different, Rome was the center of the world in terms of art at that time. So they wanted to live there, they wanted to see it. They all probably sort of knew each other indirectly. They all met there, and they had this fabulous time for 5 years, kind of having fun and enjoying the pleasures of Rome. What they didn't interact with were necessarily, I mean, they did at some point, but never as well as we would imagine. And also they found it very difficult to market their pictures in Rome. But then they obviously did. I think it's one of those things that, you always have to think about who ultimately buys the pictures. And, Canaletto, one of the greatest Venetian artists of all time, I mean, he's painting views of Venice, but, no one in Venice was buying them. I mean, why would you buy a view of your own city in your own city when you can look out the window and see it? The people who were buying Canaletto pictures were British tourists. So he had a market, a range around tourism, around people coming in. And so in the same way, I think the Dutch were thinking about the market back home, and that was the... Yeah.
I just had a quick question. First, when we say Dutch, we're really excluding Flemish here.
Yes.
Because the Flemish were, of course, in a different, there's Catholic and Protestant.
Absolutely, I mean, this is, by this point,
very
Protestant.
Difference there. The other thing was, basically then bourgeois was the one who chose the taste. King Stanislaus had really nothing to do with the influence, what he wanted to buy.
Well, I think the taste at the time was fairly standard. And so what Stanislaus would have thought as great art was probably what Bourgeois and Besson thought was great art as well.
But people told him.
So they sort of trusted him as a sort of, arbiter of taste in a way. So, I mean, we know that Stanislaus was interested in Dutch landscapes and architecture. And we also know that Stanislaus was very interested in horses. And one of the things we always wonder is there's so many pictures of horses in the collection that one does wonder if that was part of their idea.
Can you just briefly compare the three generations of painters that you spoke of?
Well, I think we can do that better downstairs, but I think the earliest generation is a generation that's still sort of experimenting and trying to work out what they were actually doing. And so Polenberg is the key artist from that generation. Polenberg is in Italy in the 16 teens and 20s. And Polenberg is there at the same time as one of the most influential landscape artists from this time, which is someone from Germany who's called Elsheimer, who moves to Rome and dies there very, very young, in his 30s. And so the two of them sort of work together at the same sort of period. But what they're doing is they're trying to do Italian landscapes, but still having subject matters in it, and little mythological scenes and things like that. It's not quite the full landscape, with no subject as we then know it. The second generation is what we're looking at effectively from the 1650s, more or less, and it is Kout and Pijnacker and all of them. The third generation is mainly based in Holland, and they're not really people who spent a lot of time in Italy or any time at all. And they're quite derivative in a way, and they're sort of following what people like Kout, Pijnacker, Birkin had done before them. And in fact, we don't have any of them in the show. The show shows the heyday, the group, the central group that was the most important one. I mean, the Polenberg at the beginning of the show, which is what I'll show you first, is just to kind of give you a sense of the change and how that happened.
So the second generation is really basically marked by the end of the 30 Years' War.
Yes.
which independence for Holland,
Yeah,
and
Absolutely.
it's 1648.
Yeah. Absolutely.